In part one of the, shall we say, more important, more serious criticisms of Protagoras, the more serious attack on Protagoras, part one was the peritrope. Remember, table turning, peritrope. We looked at that, then we had a little interlude where Socrates showed how much he's not a fan of lawyers. Now we come back to part two of the more serious attack on Protagoras. This is located, Theaetetus 179 to 187b1. This takes us to the end, basically now, of this huge chunk of the dialogue where we have been looking at the definition of knowledge. Remember, knowledge is equal to perception. This is, or episteme is the same thing as a thesis. We are bringing that now. Socrates is bringing it to a close. In other words, he's going to give us now what he thinks are in addition to the peritrope, the last couple of things that are really going to put to bed this speculation that knowledge is perception or episteme is a thesis. There's two parts to this part two. The first one is the instability of meaning discussion, and the second one is the master argument discussion. And I'll take them in sequence, starting with the instability of meaning. If it is the case, Socrates says, that the homo mensura thesis is correct, remember the homo mensura thesis, what's true for me or what is the case for me is true, and same thing for you. That whole relativized universe of various truths, no absolute truth, and then that led into all that flux. Well, if that's really the way the world is, if the world is this massive flux, there are a number of problems, right? If all is flux, then nothing is stable. Wait a second. If I make an argument to you, if I say words, I'm using them, that they have meanings, and that when I go through the argument, I assume that the meanings don't change. If they do change, then we can't really communicate. An argument doesn't work if the meanings aren't stable. Communication doesn't work if meanings aren't stable. Try talking to someone who constantly changes the meanings of words in a discussion. It's incredibly frustrating. That was the first thing that Socrates always said. Let us define our terms. So we have clarity about what we are talking about and stability. Again, if you say to someone, please define your terms, and they go, okay, and then in the middle of the conversation, they start using those words in different ways, your first reaction would be, hey, you defined your terms, now you're using them differently. What are you talking about now? So communication, for it to work, says Socrates, presupposes that meanings are stable. But again, if all is flux, nothing is stable. So meanings, whatever you think meanings are, if there's special things in the head or metaphysical entities out there, whatever, they have to be stable, right? Even if you think that meanings are just agreed upon conventions or whatever, they have to be stable. If they are in flux, we can't communicate. We can't make sense of our actions. I couldn't hold you responsible if the meanings embedded in the terms in our laws and in our judgments, if they were all unstable, what sense would the concept of responsibility even make, or blame, or praise? Any of these things. All of this currency that we use in language presupposes stability. So, if meaning isn't stable, right? If all is flux, nothing is stable. If meaning isn't stable, how could we communicate? How could you even state the flux thesis? Because if I want to talk about the flux thesis and explain it to you, every time I say, oh, the flux thesis, by the way, says this, this, and this, and says this, that, and the flux thesis, well, when I first said flux thesis and then later flux thesis, I have to be talking about the same thing. The meaning of flux thesis has to be constant. I couldn't even talk about the theory. I couldn't even state what it is because it gets worse. If by the end, by I say the flux thesis and then I say is and I start going over here, by the time I get over here, this meaning has changed? Like this is all different? So if everything is a flux, then nothing should make any sense. None of our concepts really make sense. Is that the case? Once again, remember, we have these indirect kinds of arguments. Well, if you think this, then these things follow. If you think all is flux, well, then meanings are unstable. You can't talk sensibly. But we do talk sensibly. So it can't be all as a flux. There you go. That's a more serious argument, says Socrates, in the attack on knowledge is equal to perception. Why? Because that led into the flux thesis. So by leading into the flux thesis, you get these weird results that if all is flux, then you can't even state that all is flux. Self-defeating. Another kind of peritrope style argument. So these are arguments that are logical in nature, trying to turn Protagoras' relativism back on itself. Those arguments that are the peritrope in style, as I said, have that indirect kind of thing. Well, if you think it's the case, if you think the flux is there, then you run into trouble. The last argument, which is, we could say Plato's saving his best for last. Usually that's what we do. You know, you want to save your best argument for the, sort of the climax of the play, in terms of this part of the dialogue. It's really, the big one is the master argument. Now, of course, Socrates doesn't use the term master argument. That's my term. But I just use it to point out what I think is probably the sort of the, shall we say, the climax of this part of the dialogue in the discussion of knowledge is equal to perception. So what's this master argument? Well, in many ways, it's a landmark because it separates rationalism from empiricism. It's hard to state exactly what that is, but that division is because many historians and philosophers, they debate about exactly what it means to make that distinction. And it's not a perfectly clean distinction to make, nor does any historical figure really fall completely on one side or another. But rationalists tend to say that there are some concepts that we know and that we use that you cannot derive them from sense experience. They are not empirically grounded. So you get people like Plato, Aristotle too. You get people like Leibniz, Kant, saying that there are going to be some things that are not fully grounded in empirical experience. And they have different stories as to how you ground these concepts. The empiricists wanted to say, like Sextus Empiricus, the empiricism really wants to say, no. All of the concepts that we have, they have to come from sense experience, right? It's not necessarily just raw sense experience. Yes, the mind can operate on it and all these kinds of things. But in the end, you must be able to take every concept that you use and tell me the story as to where it comes from in your ordinary experience. If you cannot tell me that story, then it's not truly a concept that has a foundation. It's a patchwork. It's something that's made up. You may have combined it in a variety of ways. That's what the empiricists say. Show me the story of how or where you got that, and it must be rooted in regular sense experience. Locke, Berkeley, Hume. It's more or less a lot of the British tradition was like that. So this divide of rationalism, empiricism, is not entirely unrelated to the geographic, shall we say, divide between the European continent, in Western philosophy that is. You find also this in a lot of Asian traditions as well. That's a whole other complicated story. But this distinction, you find this tends to be more predominant, and again, it's not a perfect distinction, but more towards the empiricists tend to be more towards the British thinkers, and rationalism more towards the continent. And then Kant is kind of a watershed, trying to bridge the two. All right, but again, even that little story that I told you is a rather potted little story. It's much more complicated. But for beginners at this stage, that's good enough. All right, so Socrates, so let's get on with it. What is the master argument? Socrates now does not use an indirect argument. He's arguing quite positively. He says that's something like this. All right, Theaetetus, do we see with or through the eyes? Do we hear with or through the ears? You know, you're thinking, what's the big deal about this? Well, he's trying to get the notion of how our senses really operate and get a better handle of how they link up and how they don't link up. So there's an appeal to the way in which the world is and how our senses and our minds relate to the world. Socrates says, doesn't really give us an argument here. He just says, you don't actually see with your eyes. You see through, not with. The eye alone is not completely independent, right? You don't, like, the eye alone doesn't see. Because if I take my eye out, it doesn't see anything, right? How does it work? Well, the eye alone doesn't see. It needs something else. But it doesn't need the other senses, right? Like you could see and not hear. Well, lots of people are like that. There's nothing unusual. Lots of people have one sense and not another. So you can hear, but you can't see. You can see, but you can't hear. So the senses are disconnected, at least in this view. We now know that senses are much more connected than Plato did, but Socrates is just making the case that your senses are fairly disconnected, but not radically disconnected. How to get this across? Well, Socrates brings in a little story here. Think of the Trojan horse, right? So yes, everybody in those days always tried to work Homer in. And Homer has the famous story of the Trojan horse. Remember, the Trojan horse was wheeled up by the Greeks and to Troy, and the Greek soldiers were, the Trojan horse was hollow, and the Greek soldiers were inside. And the soldiers were disconnected from each other, right? They're autonomous individuals, like they're individual soldiers. Socrates says, your senses are not in you, like you're the Trojan horse, that the senses are totally disconnected, as in the eye is seeing on its own and the ears are hearing on their own. No, but they're not really, but they're somewhat like the soldiers in that they're not really overlapping with each other, but they're not quite as disconnected as the soldiers are. The senses, Socrates says, are more like instruments of the soul. The soul sees through the eye. The soul hears through the ear. The soul feels through the sense of touch, etc., etc. So the soul is using the senses as instruments. The way we, so the instrument in and of itself doesn't really do it, but you need the instrument to do it. Like, I can't hammer a nail with my hand, but I can use the hammer to hammer a nail. But the hammer by itself doesn't hammer nails. It's sort of me working with it as an instrument. But the hammer is different from a saw, right? But yet I would use the hammer and the saw in conjunction to build a house. So there are ways that these things fit together and ways they don't. So how do the senses distinguish themselves and fit together? Recall an earlier discussion back in the early parts of the Theaetetus when Socrates was trying to articulate this flux thesis, and he talked about the proper objects of each sense. So sight, the eye, has its proper object, namely colors and images. And the ears, their proper their proper objects were sounds, music and noises. And then, of course, your nose had its proper objects, this smells, perfumes, and foods and smells like that. So they're partially connected, but they're connected up through the soul. So the soul is what is kind of like you can think of it as the bridge, the bridging element that connects all of these things, even though, right, your eyes can't hear anything and your ears can't see anything. But this is where we make the jump now. So this is a key part of the dialogue, a key move. So even though you have the sense here, right? So here on this side, you have your senses. And on this side, you have your proper objects, right? So remember that correlation, eyes, sights, and ears, sounds. But what you can do something that's very interesting. You can compare and contrast. For instance, you can say, that's a really intense sound. Oh, that's a really intense light. You can talk about and think about and compare and contrast across the proper objects of the senses. But the senses can't do that. You can think and compare them. So thinking can't be just a sense, another sense, because it too would have its own proper object. But it seems that thinking can take proper objects from different senses and compare and relate them. So Plato thought, Socrates thought, well, that must mean that there are instruments of the soul, and they're partially connected up through the soul. And in that sense, they can be linked, but they're not identical. So they're not in you like the soldiers, of course, but they are sort of in you in that they're linked as the way maybe soldiers are kind of by the general or the army. So in that sense, the analogy has some places that it holds and some that it doesn't, which is the essence of an analogy. So think about this Trojan horse as providing us with some ideas of how the senses are instruments of the soul and how the soldiers are more disconnected even than the senses are. So this is a key thing now, because when you're thinking and comparing, what are you doing? You're operating on the input of the senses. You're looking and comparing. So thinking can't be another sense. It operates on the senses, proper objects. Well, what have we got now? Well, when you start comparing and contrasting, saying this smell is very intense, more intense than that smell, and this smell is intense, and yeah, it struck me. I felt as sharp or whatever as that bright light. Oh, they were both really harsh. When you start doing stuff like that, you are now operating on the senses proper objects, drawing comparisons. You're now making judgments. That's what thinking is. Thinking, there's a delightful image. Thinking is the soul talking to itself. What is thinking? Thinking is making judgments, weighing, comparing, analyzing, breaking apart, recombining. Senses don't do that. The senses just truck this information in, and it's thought, which is the soul, right? So the soul here operating on these partially connected guys by really linking them up. So in this sense now, we've got thought making an appearance. We're up beyond aesthesis. Now we're talking about thinking and cognition and all these kinds of things that we normally would associate with knowledge. So Plato has got there by saying that we can do all this, but the senses can't do this. The senses can't compare themselves with each other. That you're not using your senses anymore. So you're now going beyond it. Another thing, think about this. You can say something like the color, which is a proper object of sight, and the sound, which is a proper object of the ears. Again, I'm not introducing anything new here. But what you can do that the senses can't, you can say the color is and the sound is. And fill in something, or just simply exists. The color exists. The sound exists. Those are judgments. So all you can say with the senses is like red here now. You can't really talk about existence. But Plato says, Socrates says, you use the same term, is, or exists. So now you're using the same concept, existence, to create judgments across different proper objects. The color exists. The sound exists. That is a judgment, right? That whole sentence, that's a judgment. That's not a perception. That's a judgment. Same thing. The sound exists. Those are judgments too. Plato then says, Socrates says, where does that existence come from? That's a concept you use. Makes sense? You use it. Where do you get that from? Doesn't come from, hence the rationalism, the notion of existence, the concept existence now. Of existence, that concept, that doesn't come from sense experience. There's going to be debate about that in the history of philosophy. But for Socrates, no. That doesn't come from sense experience. That enables you to talk about sense experience and its different proper objects, but this is not from sense experience. But it is absolutely crucial for knowledge. The upshot of all this is you have concepts in your mind. Existence. Identity. You have the concept of identity. It'd be difficult to explain what it means, but you certainly have the concept of identity. Everybody's talking about identity today. And now, without getting into how you unpack an example of identity, like my identity is whatever, but if we just stop at the sentence of my identity is, you've understood two very, very abstract concepts, says Socrates. The notion of the existence of something and the existence and the notion of identity, the concept, the very concept of identity. Before you go unpacking what it consists of, you have to have an idea of this very concept of identity. Where did that come from? Where on earth did you get that? Before you go into unpacking it, where did the very notion, the very concept of identity come from? Where did you get the concept of existence? Did someone teach you this is existence or this is identity? No, says Plato, says Socrates. No. Those concepts were already they had to have been in your mind. They didn't come from sense experience. Hence, the very basic concepts that we need, like existence, like identity. So concepts and like identity. Think about, I'll draw a little mathematical symbol, like the notion of infinity. Many, many centuries later, Descartes is going to talk about, you understand that. There's no way that came from your experience. You don't have infinite experiences. So you have all kinds of concepts that you understand, you work with, you use them, but they could not, so goes this argument by the rationalists, they could not have come from sense experience. But all those non-sensually based but critical concepts are necessary for knowledge. So if that's the case, if knowledge is using all these concepts to make its judgments, to think, well then clearly knowledge can't be aesthesis. Aesthesis might be, maybe aesthesis is part of the story. Maybe, yeah, in order to have knowledge, sure, you have to have some experience. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you have to have some sense input, right? But that's not the full story. You didn't know, for instance, in geometry, okay, let's have even the concept of a straight line. Right? I'm extending the argument just to sort of drive home how the rationalist approaches this. The concept of a straight line. Well, that, of course, is not really a straight line. I just drew it freehand. It's kind of sloppy and all that. But you know what a straight line is. But you've never actually seen one. However, yes, children do not, before they study any geometry, start talking about straight lines or whatever. But just because you had to learn it in school about straight lines, that doesn't mean that the concept of straight line is this, right? You learn all about numbers, right? But are numbers just simply the toy blocks you counted, even though that's how you learned about them? Don't confuse how you learn about a concept with what the status of that concept is. You learned about straight lines by drawing them on the board. Same thing with circles and all that. But that doesn't mean that the circle is is totally something that just originates in experience, because circles have properties that I could never draw on the board, yet I can understand those properties. So the whole story is that for the rationalist perspective, more or less kick-started with Plato's investigations into the concept of knowledge, is that knowledge seems to require concepts that you can't get through sense experience. And that's going to be, as I say, this landmark separation is, can you get concepts like like judgments that deal with concepts like existence and identity? Can they come through sense perception? Can you do that? Can you totally get away with saying that everything that's in the mind has to have come through experience in some way? Or do you have to say, no, there's just some things in the mind that didn't come through sense experience? That's a fundamental way of articulating the distinction. But what Plato thinks and Socrates thinks is that this stage, we have finally put the nail in the coffin of this fundamental definition of knowledge is perception. It's just not going to work. Knowledge requires concepts that you cannot get through perception. That essentially is the master argument. Now what do we do? Well, we still haven't defined knowledge yet, right? We still haven't figured that out. We still don't know what episteme is, but there is a triumph. We have now, congratulate yourself on following to the point that it's deeply problematic what knowledge is, or episteme, and it doesn't seem to be captured by the concept of experience, of perception. We need something more. What is that something more? Stay tuned.